everybody. I want to call to order the work session on Anchorage Talks Transit Choices Report. And Ms. Carsby, you have the floor.
Thank you so much. I will make this brief. First, I want to thank all of you for coming to this meeting. It's a beautiful day outside. I know it's really hard, but as I said in my email, I will guarantee this will be the best 1.5 hours you will spend this week.
Great. Ms.
And
I'm sorry to interrupt you, but I was reminded by Mr. Evans that we need to do an introduction. So we'll start with you. Thank you, Joe.
I'm Jody Cars from the Public Transportation Department.
Patrick Flynn.
Keen Flynn.
Michelle Poirot with Jarrett Walker and Associates.
Elton Great Jackson.
Bill Evans. Tim Steele.
Pete Peterson.
Julia Tucker, Assembly Council.
And in the audience?
Bart Rudolph with People Mover.
Colin Hodges, People Mover.
Terrence Bowen, People Mover.
Chris Shirley, Office Economic Kane Bell.
Ethan Berkowitz, Mayor.
Lisa Slusser, Deputy Municipal Clerk.
Thank you. Jody, you have the floor.
So one of the reasons I will guarantee this will be the best 1.5 hours is that I've been here with People Mover about 31 years, and I have learned so much through this process from these consultants. And I have told this story before, but when I came out of retirement last time and I started reading a book that this company wrote, both of my sons at different times of the weekend looked at me and said, "Mom, you know transit inside and out, and you're reading this book. You could probably write this book." And I said, I believe everything they say, but this company knows how to articulate and explain things in ways that I have never been able to do. So on that note, Michelle Poirot is with Jarrett Walker and Associates. We contracted with them to start a community dialogue of transit within Anchorage. For 31 years, I've been in some way, shape, and form planning or managing the transit system. And I started reading about what they do and realizing that my way may not have been the best way, and it's certainly not the only way. So they've come up and done a lot. Michelle's going to tell you about the public involvement process that we've followed, the decisions or choices that have to be made or need to be made. This is not anything that when they walk out the door, we're done. This is a stepping stone for my department to start looking at developing our short-range transit plan, for us to start looking at the municipality's long-range transportation plan, or the metropolitan transportation plan, as they call it now with AMATS. So this is just the beginning of a very exciting process, and we've got an hour and a half. You will have questions, I guarantee. So I will turn it over to Michelle at this time to take the ball.
Thank you. Thank you for the introduction. My name is Michelle Poirot. I'm a senior associate with a firm called Jarrett Walker and Associates. And we are transit planners. We are particularly transit network planners. So we'll be talking about networks a lot today. But our real interest and our mission as a firm is to facilitate clear conversations so that you can make confident decisions. So the conversation is part of the product. We're not just here to give a report or a map or a plan that we think is the best. We're really here to help you have a clear conversation, build your own understanding, and then make a decision in the end that you feel really confident in. So I'm very happy to take questions as I go along. Is that your usual practice to just ask?
What will happen is if somebody has a question, they'll do this, and I'll recognize them, and then I'll ask the question.
All right, that'll be great.
Good.
So, if I'm saying things that you don't understand or you disagree with, I'm happy to hear about it, because that's how this is a conversation. You point that out, and then we can talk about it a little more. So we are partway through a public conversation, and what have we done so far? And I'm being generous here with we, because actually my firm has only done a small part of it. People Mover staff has done a great deal. We published a choices report. You have the executive summary in front of you. If you enjoy the executive summary, please download the full report. There's much more in the full report. We held a public kickoff event at the museum. The mayor attended. And my boss, Jared Walker, spoke there. We had almost 100 members of the public come, and that was a chance for them to learn, but also to give input. We held a stakeholder workshop on a beautiful sunny Saturday in May. Almost 40 people came and spent 6 hours indoors with us learning about transit. Oh, thank you. We've also put out a web survey in 5 languages and had 755 people take the web survey, and I'll be showing you some results from that. And then People Mover staff have been pounding the pavement for months now, going to community council meetings, working with local organizations, getting the word out, and also getting input in person. And finally, some public meetings in different parts of town to ensure that people have an opportunity to give input someplace close to them, especially if they're not interested in or don't have access to a web survey. So first, I would like to take you through a summary of existing conditions for transit in Anchorage and the key choices that they raise. What I really want to do here is ask you to join us. We are the technical experts. I want you to join us in exploring how transit actually works at a very basic geometric level, so that you understand why we're framing these choices the way we're framing them. You understand why the choices arise from the facts. So I want to make you little experts in how transit works.
Mr. Training?
Ma'am, you said you've been going to community council meetings? Or has this been working with the community council, the staff?
13
Can you list
community-
which community councils you've gone to and when?
You want the name of
What
the
time frame?
You want the list of the 13 community council meetings
Yes.
and the dates?
And when we met with you, would please.
Sure.
Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Training. Please continue.
So first, for a little bit of context, how does Anchorage compare to other cities? Well, how does Anchorage compare to other cities in terms of investment, hours of service per resident? We looked at some cities that are similar to Anchorage in size and type and climate. And you can see that Anchorage has, sort of a moderate level of investment compared to those peers. Halifax and Victoria I threw in just because Canadian cities always best us in investment. They spend almost twice as much per capita on transit in Canada as we do. And I don't just mean in dollars, I mean in hours of service. They put out almost twice as much in service per resident than we do. And then if you look at how relevant transit is to the life of these cities, how many boardings per resident per year, you see a pretty similar pattern. I'm going to go back and forth. Investment per resident, ridership per resident. Investment, ridership. And there are 2 cities that get a lot, Bellingham and Eugene. Oops. Look at how much they get. Those are small cities with huge universities. So the moral here is you pay for what you get at a certain level. If you're not putting out service, people can't ride it. If you're a small town with a big university, you actually get more than you pay for. But everywhere else, you basically get what you pay for. So Anchorage's investment level is moderate, and the relevance of transit to the life of the city is moderate. No surprises there. People Movers' ridership over time has a little bit of reason for concern. It's certainly, there's no crisis happening here, but ridership has been very slowly declining since 2008. In the last year and a half, ridership has declined quite a bit more, which is totally typical for other small cities that we work in around the country. And it's because of gas prices. And if you had asked me a year and a half ago, what impact do gas prices have on transit ridership, I would have said very little. Because for the 15 years prior, that was true. But the drop in gas prices in the past 18 months has been so catastrophic for transit. It actually blows away the research that was done on this very recently. So the drop over the past 18 months, mostly gas price related, but as you can see, there's also reason for concern because since 2008, ridership has been very slowly going down over time. And I think that's for a mix of reasons having to do with where development is, local economic factors, a shift to a service economy, and basically the transit network is not keeping up with the changes in the city. And the other thing that we're hearing from stakeholders is that the transit network may not be keeping up with changes in the aspirations and the values of people who live here. But how do we measure ridership? This is just sheer total ridership. right? So this shows us ridership over time. There's another very important way to measure ridership, which is relative to cost. So we measure ridership relative to cost by looking at boardings per hour of service. And this is called productivity in the industry. So you might talk about a certain route as being very productive because People Mover puts out a certain number of hours of labor to get that route running, and they get a certain number of boardings in return. That's the productivity of the route. Sheer ridership, when you're looking route by route, it actually tells us very little because ridership is always happening in response to service. So when you see a lot of ridership, the first thing you should ask is, well, but how much service are we paying for to get that ridership? The denominator of this ratio really matters. Now, if we look again at those peers and we look at their productivity, again, our two small towns with huge universities, predictably very productive. Anchorage, not bad. Middle of the pack, again. So your transit agency is doing a fine job of getting ridership relative to the amount of service they're putting out. A little bit less than Victoria and Spokane. Better than Boise, better than Green Bay. Any questions about this?
Doesn't look like it.
Okay.
Thank you.
The next thing to know about productivity is that productivity and frequency are very related. Here's a scatter plot of productivity and frequency route by route in Anchorage. So on this x-axis is the midday frequency. How often does the bus come in the midday? How long would I have to wait at most if I walked out to the stop? And here, every 20 minutes, that's how often the 45 comes. Every 30 minutes, there are a number of routes, every 60, and then peak only is the 102. On the y-axis is productivity, boardings per service hour. So for every hour that these routes are out on the road, how many people on average get on the bus? And you can see a very clear diagonal trend here. The more frequent, the more productive a route is likely to be. And of course, there are interesting outliers, like the 75 or the 14. Those are always informative. But there's a basic trend, which would cause...
I'm sorry, Mr. Flynn?
Finish your comment and I'll ask a question.
Which would cause you... Many people ask the question, well, but is it, are you confusing causation with correlation, right? Is it just that a route gets more riders and so then the planners give it more frequency? Or is it that you give a route more frequency and then more people ride it? And the answer is both. Both are happening. And the way we know it's both and not just planners putting frequency where riders are is that when you double the frequency of a route, you are doubling the number of paid hours, driver hours, that you need to run that route. So you are doubling the denominator of the productivity ratio. If the productivity then stays high or gets higher, that means that people are responding by riding at least in proportion to how much you increase the service, but more likely more. So that's how you know it's not just correlation, it's also causation.
Okay, over now. Did you do a comparison or I guess an analysis using demographic and specifically income data for various census tracts with ridership?
To look route by route?
Yeah.
Not exactly the way you're describing it, but we are very aware of those demographics, and the Full Choices report has maps of all those demographics, and I'll show you a map shortly that combines them. And that is, the demographics are certainly a factor in ridership.
Thank you, Mr. Flynn. Mr. Train?
Did you guys do a breakdown on the cost per ride? Because every time we raise the rate, people complain we're not going to ride the bus anymore. And so, does the cost factor into this on cost per ride?
Yeah, so the way you can think about cost per ride is, productivity is actually almost exactly cost per rider, because an hour of service costs People Mover about the same whether they're putting it on the 45 or the 36.
But how about the cost the riders have to say?
Of the fares that the riders are paying. Will you ask me the question again?
Okay, how does the fare that you charge the bus rider impact ridership?
Well, higher fares often cause ridership to go down a little bit, and vice versa. The fare is the same on all of these routes. So it wouldn't change their
But
ridership
it's the
relative to.
same across all the other cities you had listed up?
No, it's not the same across all these.
So have you figured out how that impacts the ridership? Is
No,
it
we
fair?
didn't look at that.
Okay.
I mean, I can tell you, you can probably think on your own, intuitively about how that would impact ridership, but we didn't specifically analyze that for that group of cities.
Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Trainer. Ms. Carter?
Michelle, is there, I've always read that the industry standard says if you raise fares 10%, you're gonna lose 3% of your passengers.
Mhm.
Is that still a
Rule of thumb?
A rule of thumb?
Yes, but it's actually more complicated than that because for a lot of networks, fares are very complicated, right? You don't just have one fare, actually. There's a base fare, and then you have all of these other ways people can pay for service. Weekly passes, monthly passes, maybe they get a pass from their employer. So that's one level of nuance. And the amount those people actually pay is very different depending on what fare product they're buying. The other nuance is that some systems still charge you every time you get on a bus instead of charging you to make a trip. And the more that agencies and networks switch to asking people to transfer between routes, the more they are revisiting that fare decision. It's not like your trip is better if you get on a bus twice. Your trip is better if you get where you're going quickly. And if that means getting on a bus twice and making a transfer, well, then you shouldn't be charged twice for it. So I can't give you just a really easy rule of thumb, like if you raise fares, this will happen, because it's really nuanced. Fares are actually very complicated.
Thank you, Ms. Carter.
So you can see productivity and frequency have some relationship here in Anchorage, which doesn't surprise us in the least, because they have the same relationship everywhere else. This is the same kind of scatter plot for every local transit route in every transit system we've worked in the last 5 years, with their frequency on the x-axis and their productivity on the y. And you can see a general upward slope. So the more frequent a route is, the more productive it is likely to be. Why would this be? Frequency has huge impact on your travel time. Maybe riding the bus only takes you 20 minutes on the actual bus itself. But if the bus comes once an hour, your average wait is going to be 30 minutes, half of the frequency. And these days, somebody normally asks me, well, yeah, but doesn't waiting time not exist anymore because we have smartphones and we have real-time data? So you don't actually need to wait for a bus anymore. So can't we just run hourly routes everywhere? Waiting time has gotten much better because of smartphones and real-time data. Our level of uncertainty about when the bus is coming has gotten better, and that's a great relief. But low-frequency services, the basic problem is not that you're going to spend time waiting at the stop. It's that the schedule of the bus was not written with your individual life in mind. So the bus may get you to your workplace at 8:05 a.m. But if you're supposed to be at work at 8, and that bus only comes once an hour, you are forced to make a choice between being 5 minutes late and 55 minutes early. And the same thing is true of a medical appointment or a movie you want to see, or if you get off your restaurant shift at 8:10 p.m., but the bus came by at 8. And it's not possible to write schedules that are perfect for every single individual's individual life and movies that they want to see. The only way to really be there for people without asking them to wait, either at the bus stop or at their destination, is to be there frequently. So if you want to get to work at 8 and the bus comes every 15 minutes, the most you're possibly going to wait, the most you're going to be early to work possibly is 14 minutes, and that's not too bad. And the most you'll be late is 1. So frequency allows people to travel when they want to travel. It means that people are where they want to be most of the time. They are not stuck someplace early in a medical office or at a bus stop or even at home waiting too long for their bus. But frequency is really hard to explain for those of us who don't use transit very much. And before I used transit very much, I wasn't really aware of frequency, and I might even mistake frequency on a map for speed. I might think that a frequent bus minute went really fast, but that's not it at all. It comes often. So we're often thinking of, what's a metaphor for frequency that can help people understand this? Elevators, if you've ever been in a really big city with really big buildings and big elevators, you might have waited 5 minutes for an elevator. It's very frustrating. Very long traffic signals are a little bit like frequency, but probably the best metaphor is something that fortunately doesn't exist, which is a gate at the end of your driveway that only opens once an hour. So if you want to go to work, you have to count backwards and figure out when you have to be in your car with everything, with your key in the ignition, ready to go. And it may be that that gate doesn't open at the right time and now you're too early to work or you're too late. That's really what the experience of riding a low frequency service is like for someone who wants to use transit. So from an operations perspective, from people movers' perspective, what is frequency? How are they creating frequency? I'm going to show you and also help you understand why frequency is expensive compared to low frequency. We have one bus and one driver. That's the cost of transit is that person's time, really. It's not the bus. It's not the size of the bus. It's not even really the fuel. It's the person's time. Humans are the biggest cost center in transit operations. So we really care about how many hours they're on the road. That's what we need to pay for is time. So if we have one bus and one driver for an hour, we can have that person do one of three things. They can go over a very short distance over and over again, in which case they are delivering a high frequency service. They can go over a medium distance just twice, and they're delivering a medium frequency service, or they can cover a long distance, but they can only do it once. So if you were standing at a bus stop, at the top, a bus would go by you in each direction every 15 minutes. But if you're standing at the same bus stop down here, the bus only goes by you once in an hour. The upside at the top is, yeah, people are getting really high frequency service. That's great. They travel when they want. They're going to like that. But the upside of the line at the bottom is look at how many places you're covering. So everyone along this line has access to some service, even if it only comes once an hour. Same cost to the agency. So that's what frequency comes from. When you see a red line on one of our maps, it's because People Mover has many buses doing that instead of just one. The math works the same, by the way, if you make these lines long and have many buses on the red line and just one or two on the green line. All right. If you want higher ridership and higher fare box returns, and this if is really big, because I as a consultant will never say that you should do anything unless you first tell me what you want to accomplish. So it is not a given that you should have higher ridership on your system. That is a values call that I am not going to make because I am not a decision maker and I am not a member of your community. That is really up to you. But if you value high ridership and if you value the things that come with high ridership, such as high fare box return, low subsidy per rider, lower household transportation costs, all of the environmental goodies, then I will tell you, you should follow the ridership recipe. The ridership recipe is frequent service, which you now understand, following patterns of density, walkability, linearity, and proximity, and forming a connected network. These are all characteristics of the built environment, of the urban form. They do not include demographics, but I'll talk a little bit about demographics later. So what do I mean by density? Density has lots of cultural connotations. It can be a scary word in public conversations, but it has a very, very simple mathematical meaning in every field, including like chemistry. Density is the amount of stuff in a space. If you have more stuff in a fixed amount of space, you have higher density. If you have less stuff, you have lower density. For transit, the stuff we care about is humans. So the density of a place is simply how many humans are there in the fixed amount of area around a bus stop. And we don't even need to debate how far people will walk. Some people will walk a block, some people will walk a mile. Whatever you draw that circle around a bus stop, if there are more people within that circle, everything else being equal, you will have higher ridership at that bus stop. If there are fewer people, you will have lower ridership. Doesn't even matter what those people are like. If there are fewer of them, you just can't possibly have more of them on the bus. Linearity. Can transit run in straight lines that feel direct to through riders? If your stuff, if the places people want to go is arranged in a nice straight line, then all else being equal, you will have higher transit ridership. There are two reasons for this. One is that people find it very frustrating to have to go through all these long deviations. It makes their trip longer, and it's also just annoying. But the other is, look at how much longer this line is. So People Mover has to run this line. They have to pay for that bus to drive along this line. It actually costs more to run this than to run that, because People Mover pays for time, and in transit, distance is time. Proximity. Does transit have to cross long, low ridership gaps to reach the people and the stuff? Again, this is about distance and time. That route is a lot cheaper to run than this route, which means that for the same cost, this route can be more frequent and therefore attract higher ridership. Walkability. It's great if there are lots of people around the stop, but what if they can't get to the stop? And this is a big issue for Anchorage for a couple of reasons. One is that there are places where the street connectivity is not very good here. So you may have someone who is, within flying distance of a bus stop, but if they have to walk there on the street network, it's actually a 3/4 or 1 mile walk. The other thing is some of your streets are very wide and difficult to cross. And if someone can only access transit going one direction but not coming back the other way, they actually can't use transit at all. They have to be able to walk across the street to get to the bus stop that they get dropped off at when they get home. And then the third reason is in the winter you have a terrible problem with sidewalks being very difficult to walk on. Even I, an able-bodied person, in my Yak Tracks, like grippy shoes, I had trouble on the sidewalks. When they get really icy, it's very hard for people to walk to the bus stop.
Maybe I have a question on that.
Mr. Wilson?
As I've heard a lot about this, and it pushes, you hear a lot of, we need a grid network, and that's the optimal for all this stuff, and walkability, and I disagree with that. Because when you show this disconnected, it's not so much that the roads are all mishmash, crazy design, but you don't have pathways connected.
Right,
things
that's
that
right.
way. My neighborhood has crazy mishmash of roads, but they're all connected,
Mhm.
cul-de-sacs connected, and walking is extremely efficient.
What is
So,
your neighborhood?
I'm in Independence Park now.
Okay.
There's others similar that were designed thinking that way 40-something years ago.
Yes.
But I get frustrated that this picture on the bottom leads to the recommendation that we build cities with these grids, which means more and more road building, but we really just want to make it easier for people to walk.
Yeah.
places in a simple
Yeah.
path.
I absolutely agree. Yeah, I mean, a grid is sort of perfectly efficient, but just because of the geometric shapes. But I absolutely agree that if these cul-de-sacs were connected by pedestrian pathways, then this wouldn't be much of a problem at all. And there are great examples. I think the municipality's done a really good job of building those non-motorized connections, those little pathways that let people, get through from one development to another development without having to go the long way.
You're the only one who thinks that.
I noticed it. I noticed it in East Anchorage, but I'll look for it now that I know where else it is.
Mr. Flynn?
Yeah. This is sort of brainstorming. I'm wondering if we have a, shall we say, unique way of funding funding and maintaining our road network in the different service areas. Well, Mr. Evans represents an area that has 20-some odd service areas.
20-some.
Yeah, and then of course there's Subursa, which is all of the far northeast portion of the borough. Do you have examples that you have worked with or studied where you had, different fund sources for mass transit, because I'm wondering, we frequently get the complaint there's no service on the hillside, and you can see the mountain map, right? We hit the lower hillside a couple of times. Are there examples where a service area distinct from the main service area funds its own, shuttle to connect with the larger network?
Mm-hmm. Sure.
And
Actually,
how?
we see that most often with corporate parks, like employment areas, because they have the corporate organization to
Right,
raise
it's
the
a little
money.
different.
Yeah, but when that happens a lot in California and Washington states. If they decide to develop in a more rural area, maybe because they like the physical environment,
Mhm.
but then they're just not anywhere close to the transit network that exists, they will fund sometimes a shuttle in and out. And you see it sometimes with like big homeowners associations. It certainly helps to have some kind of organization already in place that represents it. But we absolutely do see private shuttles stepping up to fill that gap.
Yeah, we have to go, we stop a little runabout in Eagle River.
Mhm.
Might be a- Okay,
Yeah.
thank you.
Sure. All right, I can skip this because we already talked about it. Okay, so now I want to show you the frequency of your own network. And this map is in the executive summary that you have, so you can look at it on paper if you prefer. This is a very low frequency network. Most services in the city are shown here in green. They are every 60 minutes or greater, meaning less frequently than every 60 minutes. The lines in blue come every 30 to 59 minutes, so at best every half hour. And then you have one route that we would say is frequent, and that comes every 20 minutes. That's Route 45, Mountain View. So it's a low frequency network that it's really covering as much of the city as it can without turning more of those blue lines green. And when you spread transit out within a fixed budget, you spread it thin. And in transit, what thin means is infrequent. This is a map showing ridership by stop. So each bus stop in the system, colored orange, and then scaled according to how many people get on the bus there every day. And I'm sure a couple of things jump out at you, a lot of people at Diamond. This is partly people going to and from Diamond, but also partly people transferring between buses. You can also see transfers up there at Muldoon. University and the health center are big, downtown, predictably. But there's something else that I notice if I toggle back and forth, which is that there are very few big dots on a green line, and most of the big dots are on a blue or pink line. So something that we say about hourly service in the industry is you can get bad ridership anywhere with an hourly bus. You can't, unfortunately, get good ridership anywhere with a frequent bus. If you put frequent service in a place where there aren't very many people because the density is low, the walkability is poor, if you run it in a nonlinear pattern and things are far apart, you'll still get low ridership. So now a bit about demographics. People Mover also did an analysis that takes into account all of these built environment factors I just talked about. Plus, what are some of the personal characteristics of individuals that might make them more interested in riding transit? Are they living on a limited budget? Are they young or old? Things like that have an individual. Do they have a car in their household? These things have an influence on the individual. And they aren't enough, right? Because if you have a whole bunch of low-income people with no cars, but they still live really far apart, very few of them are walking distance from a bus stop, so you're still not going to get much ridership there. But it certainly does have an impact. And all of those factors are combined into a transit propensity index. This shows you the places where if you run transit in a linear pattern with decent frequency, you could expect to get decent ridership. Or even high ridership. So,
Hold on, go back. I'm sorry. Okay, I understand the. Okay, so this is a formula that you created to establish effectively.
yes.
Okay.
And, yeah.
Based on indicators of whether somebody would have more of a propensity to ride a bus
Right.
or not.
Right. And do I take it on faith that if it's blank, that nobody rides a bus?
No, that doesn't mean nobody. And it doesn't mean that nobody would. It just means that if you look at the built environment factors and the individual demographics, you would not expect high ridership there. You would expect low ridership. That doesn't mean you shouldn't put service there, because there are reasons to deploy service that do not have to do with ridership.
So a little bit of causation here in that, for example, we show a fair amount of ridership propensity at the airport because we have service there, even though no one lives there.
Oh, but you have a lot of jobs there. The transit ridership at most airports is mostly employees.
Surprising number of tourists actually here.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I mean, I'll tell you, it is coming from a place that has a really good frequent light rail line to the airport that I ride, 28 times a year. It's good for me, but that doesn't lead to high ridership when someone only rides something 28 times a year. But when I'm on there, it's the employees in their knee pads going to the cargo jobs in their Starbucks uniform going to Starbucks. That's where airport ridership comes from. That's why there's about it. There's more about this in the full choices report, including all the stuff that goes into it. So it doesn't have to be behind a curtain. So all of this technical stuff, these facts about transit, these geometric realities that transit works within, they lead to a couple of key choices. And some of these choices are common to every city and some of them are unique to Anchorage. The first one is what we describe as ridership or coverage. And this is common to every transit agency. Every transit agency struggles with this, explicitly or implicitly. So to help you understand it, I'm going to give a little fictional, imaginary illustration. How should a transit agency in this fictional town allocate its resources? In this town, the dots, there are a bunch of dots here, they're residents and jobs. You can see that they're concentrated on two straight rows, so the density is fairly high here. But there's people living on smaller roads at lower densities. And there are jobs out there. And you, the provider, have 18 buses and drivers that you can deploy each day. So maybe you hire a consultant, and you say to the consultant, we really want to maximize ridership. We want to get maximum bang for the buck, run it like a business. We need to be more like a private enterprise. And the consultant says, okay, and goes away and designs you a transit network that looks like this. The goal of this network is to maximize ridership. We are thinking like a business. We are choosing which markets we enter. We only enter markets where we can compete successfully for riders. So we enter the market of the straight roads with the high density. They're dense, they're walkable, they offer us a linear path, and because we only focus there, we put all our buses into just 2 routes, and those routes are very frequent. So the bus comes every 10 minutes. People don't even need to look at a schedule. The bus is so frequent. They just go to the stop. And as a result of that, the ridership is high. So we have maximized ridership, and we're very proud of ourselves. And we come back to you and say, you told us to maximize ridership, and here's the network that will maximize ridership. It'll be very productive, right? For the cost you're putting into it, you're going to have lots of ridership. But being sensible city elected officials, you say, oh my goodness, what have you done? What about Mrs. Jones? She rides the bus every day. She is going to be livid, and her life will be ruined because she's no longer going to be able to go anywhere.
That's why Amtrak fails.
And we say, oh, you didn't tell us about Mrs. Jones. You just told us to maximize ridership. But we can certainly do something about Mrs. Jones. And you say, yeah, actually, there are lots of Mrs. Joneses. So this time design us a network that doesn't abandon anybody. We don't want anybody to be completely without hope, completely without options. We want everybody to have access to some transit. We say, okay, we can do that. So we go away and we design you a very good network that gives everybody access to some service. Some service for everyone. Now we are maximizing coverage, more like a typical government service. We try to serve everyone, even in expensive to serve places. What we get is more routes covering everyone. Every street has service on it. Every person is within walking distance of something. But because our 18 buses are divided over so many miles and so many routes, every route is infrequent. So waits are very long, and predictably ridership is low, even in the densest, busiest corridors. Because even in the densest, busiest corridors, the wait for a bus is still an hour. And so there are lots of people there, but they don't ride the bus. We are not competing for their business. The way you measure the performance of this network is access. We can come back and say with pride, we have developed a very good network in which 100% of your residents have access to transit service. But if you ask us how productive it's going to be, we'll say, oh, well, it's not going to be productive at all. But that's not the goal. The goal is not ridership. The goal is access. Both of these goals are really, really important. In fact, they're really important to me in my own community, and most of us probably value them both to some degree, right? But they actually lead us in opposite directions when we're running a transit system. If you have a ridership goal, you think like a business, you focus where ridership potential is highest, and you get the maximum reduction in transportation costs in VMT, you get the maximum fare box return. If you have a coverage goal, your guiding principle is access for all, and you make sure to provide lifeline service for everyone. You don't focus, and you certainly don't think like a business. Now, happily, this is not a binary choice. You do not need to pick one or the other. No agency picks one or the other, but they are on a spectrum. And I think, as you probably know from the other kinds of decisions and trade-offs you need to make in government, when two goals are in conflict, a move towards one of them is a move away from the other. So they are on a spectrum. And if you want people mover to increase ridership, you are asking them to move away from coverage. And if you want them to increase coverage, you are asking them to move away from ridership. You don't need to say that one of these is the only goal, but the more clear direction you can give that accepts a move away from the conflicting goal, the better people mover can implement it. So if you want higher ridership, the more clearly you can say that and accept the coverage cuts that come with it, the better, the more successful the change will be, and vice versa. They're on a spectrum. They trade off against one another. There's another trade-off in here that's a bit more about the individual experience, and that is walking versus waiting. High ridership networks tend to ask people to walk more, and in exchange, people wait less. So you live here, you walk 10 minutes to the main route, and then you wait about 5 minutes for a bus. In this network, you live here, you don't have to walk at all. Great. But your wait for a bus is probably 30 minutes or more. So there is a natural trade-off that arises from geometry between walking and waiting. So when we talk with the public about this trade-off, we talk about walking versus waiting. Oh, and as I already said, every transit agency picks a point on the spectrum. So now I want to tell you a little bit about the public conversation on these matters. As I said, we had a stakeholder workshop. The bunch of people who came learned what you just learned. We asked them to play some games that helped them learn it even faster.
For the record, really quick, let me recognize that Mr. Dunbar has joined us. Thank you. He's from the
It's bus fleet.
Or maybe it was just infrequent. So we asked the stakeholder committee at this meeting, for yourself, how would you like the municipality to balance walking and waiting? And so at a personal level. And they said, I'm willing to walk more in order to wait less. 47% of them said that. 47% said, I'll do whatever gives me the shortest travel time. And I will tell you that at a network level, what gives people the shortest travel time is more walking, less waiting. In fact, I'm gonna go back and prove this. Here are two scenarios. This is a higher coverage network. You have routes on this street and this street, whatever their frequency is. It's not very great. Mrs. Smith has just a 2-minute walk to her route. So her travel time is 2 minutes of walking and a 15-minute wait on average for this 30-minute route. Now, what if we did something that might actually upset Mrs. Smith, and we took this route off of this street and we put it on top of the route on this street? Same amount of service on top of itself. Now she has a 6-minute walk, but she has a 7.5-minute wait instead of a 15-minute wait. And her total travel time is actually 3.5 minutes faster. So if people are willing to walk to minimize their travel time, they will have faster trips. The transit agency can provide faster trips. But as we know, not everyone can walk or wants to walk. And some people don't mind waiting. In fact, this is particularly true of seniors. You will hear a lot from seniors. You probably already do hear a lot from seniors on this issue. Seniors have more trouble walking often, sometimes, and are less likely to be bothered by a wait because they have more time often. Okay, So we asked about walking versus waiting. So we know, and we explained this to the stakeholder committee as well. So we know that actually the people in that room were very much interested in a network that offers them shorter waits and longer walks. Time check. Do we have until 1:30?
Yes, you do.
Okay, thank you.
You're welcome.
We also asked them more generally at the abstract level, how would you like the municipality to balance ridership and coverage? So like as a citywide goal, not just their own personal preference. Most of them said, by far most of them said, more ridership than you have today. Right now, People Mover is spending about half its budget pursuing riderships and half its budget providing coverage in places where ridership is predictably low. And they said 39% of people said make a small move towards higher ridership and away from coverage. And then another 48% of people said make a bigger move. We asked the same question of people at the public kickoff event. We asked them to put stickers on the same spectrum that I described to you earlier. And you can see that there are many more stickers on the ridership side than on the coverage side. We asked the web survey respondents. We showed them a ridership network and a coverage network, and we asked which they would prefer. And they were more likely to rank the ridership network higher. It's not a huge difference. I mean, there's still many people who value coverage, but more people who value ridership.
I'm thinking about seasonal ought to be a factor too, because people are not, especially older people like me, in the wintertime, if you have slick sidewalks or deep snow,
Right.
You're not going to want to walk. You'll trade that that time off, wait time off, and just leave home a little bit.
Yeah, that's right. You're right. Another way we asked this of web survey respondents is we asked them, what are your service priorities? Just ask them to sort a list of service priorities. And I'm sorry, there's a lot of things on this chart, but shorter waits was by far the most popular aspect of service in terms of people's priorities. And then shorter walks was a good deal farther down the list. So that's what we know so far about how people would make that trade-off. Balancing ridership and coverage, balancing waiting and walking.
Mr. Flynn?
Yeah, I'm just curious, do you have a breakout of the data specific to the Eagle River discussion? I'm curious because that's the one place where you had the rural meeting, rural-ish. And I think that might be informative as we think about the route structure.
We have the we asked the web survey respondents where they live, which only tells us part of the equation. We don't know where they work or where else they go. And then staff was at a meeting in Eagle River and can probably speak to just the more anecdotal conversations they had.
Okay, well, we can do that, but when you're ready to share, I don't need that right away, but at some point, people interested in that feedback.
That's a good point. Thank you. So here's another key choice that comes up in transit planning. Again, comes from geometry. Connections versus complexity. Here's a simple example. We have 3 residential areas and we have 3 activity areas. We can run direct routes from everywhere to everywhere, which is probably what a lot of people will ask us for. Right? If you're in residential area 1, you want to be able to go here, or here, or here, so you want 3 routes that go to those 3 places. The frequency of each route is every 30 minutes, and the ride takes you about 20 minutes. But there's another way we can do this, what we call the connective option. We only run 3 routes, and we have them cross paths. For the same amount of service concentrated into 3 routes, we can have them be more frequent, so they come every 10 minutes. And then the ride takes 10 minutes to the center point, 10 minutes to here. And at first glance, people might say, oh, this is no good because I want to go here from residential area 1. You don't have a route taking me there. But actually, the connected network is faster. So in the direct service option, you wait for an average of 15 minutes, either at your departure or your arrival, because the bus only comes every 30. You ride for 20 minutes. The whole thing takes you 35 minutes from the time where you want to be someplace, when you leave, to where you actually want to be someplace. In the connective option, you wait an average of 5 minutes only, ride for 10, get off, wait again an average of 5 minutes, ride for 10, get off, you get there in 30 minutes. So the connective option is faster for more people. It's also a lot simpler. It also supports your development goals better, because now you can actually say, oh, well, here are the places where we might be able to develop without everybody needing parking lots and parking spaces. Whereas when your transit agency is spread out all over the place, your transit system is spread out all over the place, it's a little harder to focus development where you want it. Transit-oriented development. Yes, sorry.
It's a little skewed because you assume that direct service is a 20-minute ride. It looks shorter to me, maybe that's 10. Then all of a sudden it flips.
Yeah, but it also works in the real world. When we do this in the
This
real
is
world, the
different.
math works also. Even when this place is not perfectly in the center, it could be over here. It still works when we do this for a real city.
Michelle, why is it simpler?
It is simpler because you have only 3 routes. So now you can tell people, do you want to ride route 1, 2, or 3? And they can keep those routes in their brain. And they can keep the map in their brain, just the same way you have a map in your brain of where the major roads are in Anchorage, and you don't have to consult your phone every time you want to go somewhere. People can keep a map in their brain of the transit system, and they don't have to consult their phone every time they want to go there. When you have 9 routes, you have 3 times as many things that people have to remember. Names, frequencies, schedules, does it run on Sunday or not, what road does it go down. Fewer routes is much easier for people to remember, navigate, and start using. So we asked people in the online survey a similar question. We showed them 2 scenarios, a more connected network that asked them to transfer, but gave them faster trips, and a more direct service network that didn't require them to transfer, but offered slower trips. And they preferred by a great deal the connected network, which was a little bit of a surprise, but that's okay. Similar strength of reaction at the kickoff meeting. We had 100 people, and we gave them all stickers. And look at how many of them put their stickers under the connected network. But there's a difficult thing here for Anchorage, which is that when you have a connected network, we're not just talking about a single transit center most of the time. In really small towns, there's just one transit center. But in a city this size, you would be asking people to transfer in different places, downtown, east side, south side. And you can't build transit centers in all those places. It's much better to just have your routes cross and people transfer there. But the difficulty in Anchorage is that your intersections are not very hospitable to transfers. So, you want to run a grid service so someone can just ride across town, get off the bus, walk across the street, wait, and then ride again. But at a lot of the major roads, because the major roads are so major, look at the walking distance from the bus stop, from one bus stop to another. This is a very long walk, and this is a scary walk, actually, when you have to cross the road.
2 roads on the road.
I know it's not, a lot of roads are not your road. So the distance is a problem, the environment is a problem, we know that snow is a problem. And part of the reason, I don't know if you know this engineering, but part of the reason the bus stops are so far away from the intersection is because if you put a bus stop close to the intersection, it's awesome for transit riding, but it gets in the way of the free flow of right-turning cars. So that's why they're so far back. So this is a trade-off that leaves the transit sphere and gets into roadway engineering. Third key choice, rush hour or all day, all week. Your system is not very peaked, but it's a little bit peaked. You have a little more service out during rush hour. This blue line shows transit vehicle trips. Basically, how many transit vehicles are leaving the garage or leaving the end of the route throughout the day. And it's a little higher in the morning and then a great deal higher at 4. But look at what happens with your boardings. That's what this orange line is. They're way up in the middle of the day. And then by the time extra services hit the road in the evening rush hour, boarding's already starting to come down. So there's a bit of a mismatch between the schedules and the demand. And something we heard a lot of from stakeholders is that the lack of evening service is a really big impact for them. And this may have something to do with your decline in ridership. Service, you're shifting to a service economy along with the rest of the country, but the schedule doesn't work for a service worker. They can get there in the afternoon, but they can't get home when they get off work at the restaurant or wherever the bar. They get off work at 9 or 10 p.m. and the service is not there anymore. Same thing for Saturdays and Sundays. Saturdays and Sundays are all hands on deck for service workers, but the people mover schedule is very spare on the weekends.
Mr. Training?
To transit, are we planning to increase the running shift at Diamond Mall? That David Buster's going in there, talking to the guy that owns it, he's planning to keep it open 7 days a week to midnight. So are we planning to increase the transit going into the Diamond Mall?
Right now, we have nothing planned for anything until after we finish this process and figure out, do we want to be a coverage oriented or a ridership, or where are we in the spectrum? And, if we increase with our budget, if we increase service here, unless the budget increases, we're gonna have to take it from somewhere else.
Yeah, I just wanted to know that he is planning on keeping that open, that David Buster's opens to midnight every day of the week.
And the Diamond Center is a great example. It is much busier on Saturday and Sunday than it is Monday through Friday. And that's not uncommon for retail facilities like that. And yet our service is skewed to Monday through Friday. Whether it's evenings or work day, work hours or what have you. So that may be a big change for us to contemplate, is should we adapt more to when the riders want to ride the bus rather than when we kind of have our vision of when commuters ride the bus, because that indicates that 8 to 5 employees are not the people that currently want to ride our buses.
Thank you, Mike.
Thank you, Mr. Abbott. Thank you, Mr. Training. Mr. Flynn?
Yeah, well, sort of following on that, do we have a feel for why we're seeing high ridership at 3 o'clock in the afternoon as opposed to school? Is that with kids?
School is part of it historically. One high school lets out, we've always noticed it, and as Michelle said, we're not, Anchorage of today is not Anchorage of the 80s, where it was predominantly Monday through Friday, 8 to 5. We have so many service workers who are working, going in at 6 and working until 10 or midnight.
So do you think those are people heading to work for the evening shift?
Mm-hmm. And then somebody gives them a ride home.
Okay. And then, we had Uber here for what, 3 or 4 months? What sort of effect do we see on ridership during that period?
We have not done an analysis of that.
I think that would be useful, not because I think Uber's ever going to agree to the terms and conditions that we'd impose, but as we think about a future with more driverless cars and things of that nature, and how that integrates into the network, like that little chunk of data we
I've always felt that transit is like a spectrum of services. It's a toolbox of services we have to offer, and our Anchorage is one of them for people with disabilities. We have our fixed route, we have a van pool program. I think Uber could fit in well. I mean, Michelle, you've done where your other clients, some have Uber and some do not.
Mm-hmm.
And what, I guess I'd ask you, what do you see?
It's really hard to separate from the gas prices because it's all happening at the same time. So we have clients who are seeing ridership go down, and it's probably mostly gas prices, but they're not sure if Uber's having an effect.
Well, I think we're a good test case. We operated for free
Mm-hmm.
because it didn't have licenses for what, 4 months? Is that about right?
And the state told them to participate in this thing.
Yeah.
Yeah.
So you have a little experiment.
Yeah,
Yeah.
so that'd be a good data set to analyze.
Yeah.
Lars got it. All right, good work. Thank you. I saw you, by the way, in the picture, the stakeholder.
Yeah.
You're easy to
Stand
pick
Since you mentioned driverless cars, I want to point out it's good to start thinking about driverlessness and what that could mean for transit service. It doesn't just happen on the private side with Uber. It can also happen on the public side. I don't know if you've ever gone to an airport and caught one of those little airport trains and it takes you in a circle.
Seattle.
Yeah.
does that.
And it comes every 2 to 3 minutes, right? Why can it be so frequent? Because there's no driver. So there's no marginal cost to putting more trains on the tracks. So they can run as many trains as they want, and they have a supervisor sitting in the room. So I don't know if we're talking 10 years from now or 50 years from now. I really don't know what's coming in the future. But whatever happens with driverlessness that makes Uber cheaper or taxis cheaper or a personal car cheaper may also make transit a lot cheaper. So,
Thank you, Mr. Whittleton.
You know, I kind of anecdotal. I own a store in the Diamond Center, and with 6 employees, only one has a car and drives, and the rest walk or take the bus or carpool.
yeah, and I should mention that there are a couple of routes in your system that are more productive on Saturday, even though they're only hourly. They're even less frequent on Saturday. So there's less service, but more people get on the bus for every hour that's being put out on Saturday on certain routes. So that is an indication of this latent demand for service on the weekends.
Thank you, Mr. Steele.
I was just going to throw out the legislature's planning to move to Spinard, if that comes Spinard. And
Find me a legislative aide who rides the bus, and I'll find you.
well,
a pilot
I'm
in
thinking
Alaska.
about people going to testify when the legislature's in session. I mean, so that's basically route adjustment. It's not anything to do with.
They ride in Juneau, because they've got a
Free
good
bus pass.
network and a good system. You can get, easily to the valley and to Douglas, 2 of the residential areas.
Well, it's pretty, it's just a pretty straight shot, right? It's not complex at all, it's just how you back it.
They're not
Getting off the topic.
Are we finished with this conversation, gentlemen?
Yes.
Please continue. Thank you.
So we asked the committee, the first line there's wiped off, but I'll tell you, how should rush hour and non-rush hour service be balanced? And they said, very few people said current balance is about right or more rush hour service. Most people said more evening weekend service or much more evening weekend service. Similar indication from the people at the public event. We gave them stars to put on their spending priorities. Somebody went rogue and put their orange dots over here. Those don't count. And you can see the most popular responses were frequent service, I already said that, but also service after 8 p.m. and weekend service, as opposed to direct routes, fewer transfers, coverage of more places, rush hour service, or even midday service. There wasn't a lot of support for midday service. When we asked online survey respondents a similar question, what are your spending priorities? I've already shown you this. Frequent service was top, but weekend service and then rush hour service, so these are in conflict, right? And service after 8 p.m. So these 3 things, you can't increase service at all these times without decreasing service at one of these times. So these are in conflict, but weekend service and rush hour service both rose to the top there.
Mr. Flynn.
Yeah, Jody, does it cost you guys more for that increased frequency around rush hour? You paying overtime for that, or
I mean, putting it a different way, if we flattened out the service somewhat so that we could extend more weekend and evening service, would your labor costs go up or down or stay the same?
It would probably be the same, but you would, instead of paying, when you have a peak, you pull out the morning and bring it back for midday and you bring it back for the PM peak. You got a lot of dead head time between those pullouts and other costs that are not as efficient. If we flattened it out, so we didn't peak twice in the day, the system is a lot more efficient and your costs would go down.
Also, you need to maintain a bigger fleet to have those peaks than you would need to maintain if you had a flat schedule. You could have fewer buses, which means buying fewer buses, maintaining fewer buses, fewer mechanics, all that. Debt service on fewer buses.
Thank you.
Now, I want to present something it's not a key choice, it's not an urgent thing for you to deal with. However, I think it's good for you to understand for the future, and that is the relationship between stop spacing and speed. When you have stops very close together on a road, it makes your buses go a lot slower. Because so much of the time that buses spend is actually pulling over, slowing down, stopping, boarding passengers, putting on their blinker, waiting to be let back into traffic, pulling out, re-accelerating. And if they do that every block, they move pretty slowly. And what that means is that you actually go less far with a single bus and driver in an hour. So for your unit of cost, you are either covering less distance or delivering less frequency. Because they just don't go as far. They're going much slower. So whether what you want to see is more frequency or more coverage of more places, the slower your buses go, the less of it you're going to be able to afford. The thing is, people react very badly to the removal of bus stops. This is in our DNA. I don't think there's anything a transit agency does that is harder than taking out a single bus stop. Because every single bus stop, no matter, even if it's like on average 1/10 of a person uses this bus stop per day, meaning every 10 days someone uses it, they may really, really need it. And if you take it out, they will come and they will tell you how you're ruining their life, and you might be. So removing bus stops is really hard, but at a network level, it has the potential to unlock a lot of resources, which you can then spend giving faster service that is also more frequent or provides more coverage to more people. So this is a really difficult trade-off I want you to be aware of. Don't need to look at that again. All right, I want to leave you with a couple of key principles as you think about these choices that are coming. One is, be careful not to be too binary about transit and transit ridership. Our marketing departments tend to split people into buckets because then you can market to them more efficiently, and that is very appropriate for marketing. But that is actually not how transit planning works. Transit planners will sometimes talk about the choice rider, has a car, but make him leave it in the driveway. You have to win his business. As opposed to the dependent or captive rider who has to use transit no matter how bad it is. But the truth is we're actually all somewhere in the middle. It's actually a spectrum. Everybody's somewhere on this spectrum, from very dependent to absolutely loves driving, super luxury car, has all the time in the world, never going to ride transit. And we know it's a spectrum because when an agency takes a transit line that has decent ridership and increases the frequency, even by a little bit, they get an increase in ridership. And if these people were in buckets and they didn't respond to small improvements, then you wouldn't get an increase in ridership from a small increase in frequency. You would have to yank out that bus line and put in a beautiful high-speed train with luxurious stuff and coming every 5 minutes, and then all the choice riders would get on it. But that's not how it works. You can take an ordinary bus line that comes every 20 minutes and you can make it come every 15, and you will get more ridership. Because everyone is at a different place on this line, and everyone is starting new habits and having things happen in their life that cause them to look at transit from time to time and think, maybe I should try that. And if they wait 10 minutes instead of 15, they do it again. So we're all on a spectrum. And the more of the complication that makes everybody so different, makes everybody respond to these incremental improvements that you can keep in your mind, I think the better you'll be able to move people forward. The other thing is that transit really thrives on diversity, not on specialization. So as transit decision makers, you will have people coming at you describing what would be perfect for them. And many of them will misinterpret that as a recipe for high ridership. They'll tell you, if you only ran a bus on Saturdays and Sundays to this awesome place that I love to go to on Saturdays and Sundays, you would have tons of riders. But when you really specialize so narrowly to be perfect for a small number of people, you end up creating something that is not very useful for most people. And real high ridership transit comes from services that are good enough for a large number of people who are all going different places at different times of day for different reasons, and they have different backgrounds. If you go to a full bus anywhere in this country, chances are it looks like that. People going to work, people going to the park, people taking a kid to daycare, people going to a medical appointment, people going to a movie. That's where you get high ridership. So push back a little bit against that urge to specialize. Private industry specializes. They don't have the kind of overhead costs that you have. They don't have the public obligation you have. Transit succeeds through diversity, not through specialization. Finally, is this the transit question? The other thing people come at us with all the time is their favorite transit vehicle. It used to be monorails, then it was streetcars and light rail. Now BRT is really hot. And what they're really describing is what transit looks like from the outside. And people get very excited. I get excited about trains. I love riding trains. But the real transit question is, how many of the people in your city can access the riches of your city and all the opportunity it has to offer in a relatively short amount of time. That's what transit is from the inside. And here's what that might look like. These blobs on a map of your city show where this person who's standing at the university can go in 15, 30, 45, and 60 minutes using transit and walking. So this is a mathematical exercise then that's mapped. You can get from Diamond Center to the university in an hour, just about an hour, using transit plus walking. And look at how much she can access within the city. You can see the effect of the local routes there. This is really what transit offers. Two things. One is the ability to expand those blobs, to take the walls around people's lives and move them out so that there are more educational opportunities, more jobs they can apply for, more people they can meet and marry within the walls of their life. The other thing that transit can do is make it so there's more stuff in those blobs. So that as the walls move outward, there are more jobs in the spaces people can go efficiently, quickly by transit. Your high ridership network is a place where businesses want to locate, where universities want to locate, where apartments go up because people can use transit and not have the expense of owning a car. This is transit from the inside. This is the good that transit does. So this last principle is not to get too focused on what it looks like from the outside, even though that's so much of what the popular media focuses on and what we hear from our friends and family. So the next step in this process, we are actually going to take these fictional illustrations and we are going to show you what this would look like for Anchorage. We're going to draw you two maps. They won't be this extreme. A map that's very much about maximizing ridership with just a little bit of coverage service, and a map that's very much about maximizing coverage with just a little bit of frequent service. And it won't be a binary choice. We're not going to show them to you because you have to pick one. We're going to show them to you so that you can start to really understand the spectrum that they describe. And you can then tell People Mover, here's where we want to be on that spectrum. We understand the trade-off. We've heard from the public about this. We want to be here on the spectrum, ultimately. That's the next step. So that happens in August. We're going to probably call them conceptual networks, a conceptual high ridership network and a conceptual high coverage network. And then we'll put them into an expanded choices report that is basically that one, but with another chapter that says, if you're having trouble imagining it so far, here's what it would look like. That's what I have.
Thank you very much. Any other questions? Mr. Steele?
I got one for transit in terms of the bus pass for students. I presume that had an impact on you in terms of frequency of routes to collect people and to deposit people based upon school hours, that kind of thing, in summer. Is that true? Was that a high impact item?
When you asked it had an impact on our frequency?
It certainly had an impact on your ridership.
It had an impact on our ridership because it had nothing to do with frequency because we did not change
You didn't
our
change that at all.
service. Right. The reason those programs work really well, and we have, ConocoPhillips has one of those UPass agreements, UAA, Charter College, APU, we have probably about half a dozen UPass agreements. The reason they work so well is that one of the big barriers to people who want to ride the bus is the fear of the fare.
Mm-hmm.
How do I pay the fare? How much is it? I don't want to look stupid.
Mm-hmm.
So those UPass agreements get rid of that barrier by just saying, show your ID. And at the schools, that was it. It's show your student ID and ride the bus free.
The school said that was great for them because students would stay after or students would come in early for sports or whatever.
It was great. We carried about 65, 70,000 trips during that semester. But the school district is not electing to renew that agreement.
They have a few little budget things.
That's exactly what it is. It's still a good thing, and again, UAA, we've been doing it with UAA since the 80s, late 80s, and they love the program because with UAA, they feel that by getting one person on the bus and out of their car, they can turn their parking space over like at least 3 times a day. So they have a huge, it's a huge benefit.
There was a little controversy on the road cut through there that night.
It's not very good.
Anyway,
Thank you, Mr. Steele. Mr. Flynn?
Yeah, this just, sorry, I asked this question clumsily. I have worked with people who do transit-oriented development, housing, employment centers, so on and so forth around transit. We have somehow managed to turn our single transit-oriented development, VAC, into a negative relationship. Instead of increasing property values, it's decreased them.
And which is that? I'm sorry.
The bus accommodation center, the transit center.
Oh, okay.
I mean, you can't rent the space.
Right.
Or at least not competitive. So it would be useful if we could, in the context of the expanded choices report, look at how we might leverage transit hubs to drive development in a way that actually increases value. And I know that's not a remarkable thing. It happens everywhere, just not here.
Yeah, and it often happens actually because whichever agency controls this decides to offer developers a fairly concrete benefit to locating on a certain quality of transit. So something that's much more common now is that in the medium-sized cities is the development code may say if you locate on a frequent transit line, which might be light rail or might be bus, and they then define it, which means every 20 minutes or better this many hours a day, then you don't need to provide as much visitor parking, surface parking, garage space, whatever it is. So the most successful efforts have been actually lowering the hard costs that developers experience from development in response to the proximity of useful transit.
You two are confusing what TOD
Excuse me,
is.
sir.
Sorry.
Thank you.
Yeah.
Are you finished, Mr. Flynn?
Well, I just shooty left, but someone could make sure you heard that.
And I think there's a good opportunity here, which is what is the regional plan that's coming up?
Land use map.
MTP.
Yes, the MTP is a great place to make that connection. So whatever this process settles on in terms of the future network, if it's clear where the high ridership potential corridors are, then that land use planning could move forward in another process.
I will be stunned if the MTP take that into account.
Okay.
Thank you, Mr. Flynn.
But I'll leave that to Mr. Welton to make sure.
Thank you, Mr. Flynn. Mr. Cheney?
Jody, do we have any factor that tells ridership for the city employees? You know, they just have to show their ID card, they work for the city. Do we have any figures on the ridership for city employees?
It's about, the last I looked, it's about 35 municipal employees making round trips. So it's about 70 trips a day-ish. Very low number. Part of it is, we haven't marketed it really well to this building. And also, if city employees, like out on, Tudor Road is not a bad place, but because we're spread out all over, a lot of municipal employees are not where there is good bus service. Here, it's really good, and most of them, I believe, are from this building.
Thank you, man.
Thank you, Mr. Cheney. Mr. Evans?
Thank you, Madam Chair. I'm not sure if I have a question or a comment. I'll just start talking, and if I say anything that you can answer, that'd be great. The idea that Jody mentioned, that there seems to be, I would think, in all this, a tremendous inertia for people not to ride public transit who haven't ridden public transport for all the reasons you mentioned. That I don't understand where the routes go, I don't know how to pay, I don't look like an idiot, I don't know who else is on the bus, all these reasons that just keep people on that spectrum that can drive, and so because of that inertia they choose to drive, where if they rode the bus one time or had the experience, you would open up a lot more people. And I was thinking that with respect to the weekend and off-hour routes or expanding service in that area, you catch people who aren't riding the buses at all, But in doing that, you may get them to actually ride the buses during the other times as well, once they become accustomed to using it. And I don't know if there's in all your studies, is there a formula for how, in a city like Anchorage, how much of that market is just an untapped market that's not necessarily frequency driven or anything else, but it's just simply human psychological inertia.
Yeah, there's certainly a lot of inertia, and people have their habits, and they stick with their habits. But fortunately, there's this constant churn of people changing their habits, right? People get a new job in a different part of town, or they move, or they lose a car maybe, or their child gets of driving age and is faced with a choice about whether to get a car. There was a woman who came to the public meeting, and she raised her hand and she asked a question. She said, I started at the university last fall, and I looked at the number 45 bus line, and I looked for housing on the number 45 bus line. And then she said something about housing availability, but we transit nerds had stopped listening because we were so excited that someone had come to town and figured out the most frequent bus line that goes to the university and looked for housing on it. And she's not the only one. Whenever people come to a new place or come to a new job, they sort of look around for what are their options. And that's where you pick up ridership. That's why if you change frequency, you don't get the ridership immediately. You get some bump immediately, but the real growth is over about 2 years as you have that churn and people discover it. They overcome their inertia because something else in their life has changed. So I think that's the opportunity for growth is, can you present something, if you want higher ridership, then can you present something that's marginally or a great deal more useful so that as people go through moments of change in their life, when they try it, they discover how useful it is. And that might be on a Friday evening or a Sunday when they don't feel like driving.
If I can, it's not a follow-up, it's just actually a different question. But we talked about it earlier as far as the cost of labor being the main factor in this. Do you have sort of a percentage of your budget, how much is labor and how much is everything else?
About 80% of the cost of a bus hour is is labor. It's not just the driver, it's supervisors and mechanics and all that, but it's labor.
Thank you, Mr. Evans. Mr. Peterson.
Thank you, Madam Chair. I'm interested in, are we going to try to keep track of the reduction in ridership or from the high school students that now that they don't have the bus pass? Because one of the things I heard, they had done a survey to one of the high schools, either Broward or Easton, asked them, why don't you ride the bus? And there was a significant portion of them that said, well, they weren't sure where the bus stops were, didn't know how much it cost, didn't know if it would take them to school in time, all these different questions. And so now that they have the free bus pass and maybe used it, I'm wondering if the ridership isn't going to go back down to where it was before, if some people will, now that they're educated, so to speak, and how it works, will continue riding.
Right, and I believe that's exactly what will happen. Bart and the planning staff, they're looking at ridership all the time. What's happening with ridership? Unfortunately, like Michelle said, people are coming in, making decisions. They're coming in onto the bus and they're moving. So we may lose, we will lose some of those new people or the school kids, but we're going to gain maybe from other schools where they're going to come up. We are losing riders. Our ridership is on a downward track. Part of me thinks it's because we haven't done anything. We haven't added service. Back in probably 2002, we did a route restructure study, not nearly as awesome as this one, but we added 18% more service through a CMAQ grant, a 3-year grant, and we got, so 18% more service, we got 28% more riders, 28%. The industry standard says you add 10% more service, you're going to get 7% more riders. It won't be a 1-for-1. There are, other factors involved, but we have. If you build it, they will come. If you put it out there, they will ride. And it's just, do we have the funding to do it?
Yeah. There is actually another key choice, which I didn't cover in here, but it is mentioned in the report, which is just, is the current level of funding sufficient to meet your goals? And that depends entirely on what your goals are.
Thank you, Mr. Peterson.
One additional thing, and I was just talking to Mr. Steele about this. I don't have the statistic, but I would bet that there were higher graduation rates at Eastern Bartlett this year because of those free bus passes.
Thank you, Mr. Peterson. Mr. Steele.
Yeah, I've just been, you kind of spurred a brain cell to work. And I'm thinking about special events downtown. Parking downtown is a nightmare when there are special events, but I'm sure it's also a nightmare to get buses in and out. But designing, being able to implement something quickly for special events seems like it might be an untapped source.
Thank you.
One thing, Mr. Steele, I couldn't have asked you to ask a better question. Last week when the calendar of events came out for the 4th of July, and I was looking at it, it's like, holy smokes, look at everything that's happening downtown. Downtown's our biggest hub. So I talked to our marketing folks and said, let's start buying an ad on that page to say, don't drive your car downtown, take the bus. Let's buy it and start promoting our bus service downtown, especially on the weekends.
And that happens for sled dog races, it happens at Cuddy Park when there's an event there.
Hockey games.
Hockey, events down to Sullivan. There's all kinds of things, but you have to be able to react quickly, I suspect, to be able to take advantage of it.
And there's another element there. Being able to react quickly is part of it, but
Have
people.
the resources.
And the resources, people are much more likely to turn to transit for a special event if they already have some experience riding the
Yes,
transit normally.
that's true.
If they've never gotten on it before, they're very unlikely to ride. So transit works best for managing special event flows when it's already getting a lot of ridership. So then it's a very easy sell to people. It's like that bus you ride downtown normally on the week, ride it on Sunday also, rather than figure out something brand new, figure out where to leave your car, learn a whole new information architecture. So all of those parts go into play.
Thank you, Mr. Steele. Sam, we have about a minute left. Did you want to make a comment before we end this work session?
I apologize. The issue of transit-oriented development is kind of, it's not a building with a bus stop out front, or it's not necessarily a place where transit users transfer. That's not what TOD is. And I want to be very clear that as the talk of a potential new transit center or anything like that is out there. This is wonderful.
Thank you very much.
Can I?
Certainly.
I'll make it quick.
No, go ahead.
Thank you, everybody, for coming to this. This is, I've never had a work session with the Assembly on Transit that has been so well attended. And it just, after 32 years, I'm going out with a big smile on my face because I really appreciate you guys spending a beautiful day to come and listen. Michelle is awesome. I've got an awesome team with Transit, and for the new folks, or even some of the existing folks, if you would like to come out and see what we do and just talk to my staff, please feel free to give us a shout. And thank you.
Mr. Training?
Michelle, can you give us a copy, DVD of all your slides?
Sure.
Because they're not all in here. Jody, if they're coming back in August, we'd like you here. And if you're not, no resolution in front of the Assembly.
I'm going to talk to Mike about my ability just to come back because this is near and dear to my heart.
I know, and that's the reason we'd like you here, okay?
I have one quick comment before we end the work session. I've never rode a motorcycle like Mr. Weddleton. But Jody knows, and for those who don't, I've lived here for 33 years and I rode the bus 21 of the 34 years that I've lived here in Anchorage. Half by choice and the other because I didn't have any choice, but it was great. It really was. I don't want to do it again. But anyway, thank you. Work session is adjourned.